Okay, class, so here we are again. I have a voice. I am recording a video for you. This video is going to cover all of Chapter 5. There will be a video covering Chapter 6. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to it tonight or not. It's already pretty late, and I have a very early day tomorrow. So, Chapter 5, we're going to get through all of it, or everything that I care about today, so buckle in, take notes. Don't be afraid to watch this video more than once. The timing of me getting sick and losing my voice kind of sucks because I think this is where things start to get really interesting. Once we start to move into complicated polyphony, that opens up doors for all kinds of other things. And this is actually what you tend to spend most of your time studying in grad school. So most of what we're talking about today, we're talking about early polyphony. Polyphony meaning multiple voices that are moving independently. Or are they? The earliest kinds of polyphony that we know about in the Western tradition are part of a practice called organum. Now, in organum, we have two different voices in the earliest descriptions. We have, I'm going to write it down for you, the principal voice, which in Latin is the vox principalis. And then, that's awful, sorry. There we go, vox principalis. You can still see the words, I'm sorry. Vox principalis, the principal voice, and the vox originalis, the organal voice. Now, the earliest descriptions that we have about organum describe it as a practice of improvising. So in other words, they're explaining to you how people are doing it, but it was a practice that existed before it was written down. By the time we're writing about it, it's already something that's very well established. So some of the earliest examples we have of simple organum, the earliest kinds of organum, these are things that come to us from a source called Musica in Chiriatus. And now you're going to see how messy my office is, and I'm very sorry. I thought about cleaning it up, and then I forgot all about it. But all my musical examples are on my computer over here. So, what we see in Musica in Chiriatus is a few kinds of very, very simple doubling of a melodic line. Or when I say melodic, I mean the principal voice, which is probably taken from a chant. What we see are a few minor variations. So the first variation we see is where we basically have a drone that goes underneath the chant. And the drone is often the final pitch of the chant, so that at the end of the chant we have this nice cadence and we know that we're at the end. Another thing that we see quite frequently is something called parallel organum. Parallel organum is when we just mirror the melody, but at an interval below the melody. And in the early examples of organum, we are only interested in the perfect intervals. So those are the intervals of the fifth, the fourth, the octave, and the unison. One of the things that's interesting about mirroring in parallel fourths is that there's a possibility that you are going to end up with a tritone, which at the time was called diabolus in musica, which means the devil in music. Not because we actually thought it was evil, but because we don't like how it sounds and we don't want to have it in our music. We just don't like it. So what often happens if you are doing parallel organum at the interval of a fourth is that they are going to freeze the additional organal voice so that we cannot actually create a tritone. So sometimes the voice is going to stay right where it is, and once the pitches in the original chant melody rise a fourth above that original drone, then we start to have the organal voice, the added voice, mirror at the interval of a fourth, but not until the melody rises up to a fourth above that final pitch. Let me demonstrate all of these. So I've got them pulled up over here. Excuse me. Hopefully you can see this. So the first example that we have, I'm going to pull this one up. This is an example of parallel organum. And if you look carefully, I hope you can see this. You can see it. Excellent. Sort of. You can sort of see it. Sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. What we have is mirroring at the octave. And then also in the second line, we have mirroring at the interval of a fifth. So lots of parallel fifths. We don't mind parallel fifths during this point of time. That is something that comes to us later. Here are some examples. So we start with organum of the octave. In other words, we just have the original voice, the principal voice, being mirrored at the interval of an octave.
Nos qui vivimus benedicimus Dominum, ex hoc nunc et usque in saeculum.
Okay, then we go to organum of the fifth.
Nos qui vivimus benedicimus Dominum, ex hoc nunc et usque in saeculum. Nos qui
There's the
vivimus
fourth.
benedicimus Dominum, ex hoc nunc et usque in saeculum.
And you'll notice down here at the bottom, I hope you can see it, where they're talking about the fourth. We actually have the introduction of an accidental. We have introduced F sharp. The reason for the F sharp is because the fourth above F is B, and we're trying to avoid the tritone. The other thing we could do, depending on the mode, is we will actually see the introduction of B flats instead of B naturals at this point in time. Okay, moving up. So these are all examples of parallel organum.
Nos vivimus benedicimus Dominum, ex hoc nunc et usque in saeculum.
All right, if we want to see oblique organum, oblique means that it happens over a drone, or in this case, we have oblique and parallel organum. This is the kind of thing I was telling you about before. We begin on the pitch of C, and the organal voice remains on C until we reach the interval of a fourth above C. Then it begins to mirror until we approach the final cadence. And oftentimes we'll find that the final cadence is in unison. This just helps us realize that we've got a cadence that we are approaching. So here are two examples of mixed parallel and oblique. Oblique would be if we never move beyond just a drone in the organal voice. Parallel is when we are moving at a particular interval, oftentimes fourths. The next person that we talk about in the textbook is Guido of Arezzo. So we've already spoken about Guido of Arezzo at a fair amount of length because he introduced the solfege syllables that we use today based on the hymn Ut queant laxis. The first pitch of every phrase begins at one pitch higher than the previous, and that's the basis of our modern solfege syllables, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. Ut eventually is replaced with do, and eventually we also add t, but that didn't exist in Guido's time because he was operating assuming that we built everything off of hexachords. The system we use today uses heptachords, meaning 7 different pitches. And then after the 7th pitch, we repeat, which we call the octave because the 8th note repeats. Okay, so going back to Guido, we've talked about him because of his introduction of solmization and this idea that we can give pitches abstract names that are independent of their actual like what the words are in whichever chant it is you're doing. He also introduced a method of teaching people how to sing new songs by pointing at different knuckles on the hand, and those different knuckles would tell you to move up or down by step. He also added 4 lines to an early musical staff that is still used today when you are reading plain chant notation in modern hymnals. But the reason that Guido comes up in this chapter is because of his book called Micrologus. Now, I couldn't actually find any examples from Micrologus. I'm very sorry. But what the book mentions is that the organum that is described in Musica in Chariatus, all the organum that we were just listening to, what they are describing to you is a method. Like, you can mirror the melody at a 4th below or a 5th below or an octave below, or you can introduce a drone. Here are some rules you need to follow. But there's not actually any point in writing anything down. This is just so that you understand how the process works. The music that is explained in Micrologus by Guido is more complex than that. You're not just following one simple rule, you're following a number of different possibilities. So this means that we're starting to see polyphony become more complex. And the more complex polyphony becomes, the more it starts to look like modern music. All right. So moving on from Guido, the next thing that is brought up in the textbook is Aquitanian organum or Aquitanian polyphony. So let's look up Aquitaine. I'm not sure if you've heard of Aquitaine before. Maybe you've heard of Eleanor of Aquitaine. I don't know very much about her either. I have heard the name, and I'll learn more about her at some point. But Aquitaine is a particular region in France that I have pulled up for you. Right there. So there's Spain right there. There's a modern Belgium. So Aquitaine is in this corner here. It's the southern part of France and bordering not the Mediterranean Sea. I guess that would be the Atlantic Ocean. This is also the part of France where the troubadours were active. So remember, trouvères are from the northern part of France, troubadour are from the southern part of France. So what we see with Aquitanian polyphony is it is more complex than the polyphony described in Musica in Chariatus and also by Guido in his Micrologus. So what we have is the voices are still mostly moving together. If you look at these other examples, it's note per note, they are moving together. We do have some limited melisma. Let me write down that word for you because it is important. And my other class hadn't heard this word before, so we're going to assume that you also haven't heard it. Sorry, melisma. A melisma is just an extended passage in which we have ornamentation of many pitches in one voice to one pitch in another voice. Or another way of thinking about it is how many pitches we have for one syllable. That is melisma. So for the most part, when we're looking at Aquitanian polyphony, what we see is when we are moving note against note, all of the vertical sonorities, in other words, what we would call chords today, but they're just 2-note chords. All of the intervals between these notes that we see together are perfect intervals. There are no imperfect intervals. Perfect intervals being the octave, the 5th, the 4th, and the unison. During this period of time, anything that was not a perfect interval would be considered dissonant. and therefore we avoid it. That means that thirds and sixths are still considered dissonant, and we do not see very many of them in music of the Middle Ages. This is one of the reasons that it sounds so strange to us today. So when we listen to a version, this is the one that's mentioned in our textbook when we're talking about Aquitanian polyphony. We see a style in which we have the two voices moving mostly together, and you'll notice that two things have happened. First of all, the main voice is the voice that is written in these white notes. This is what we would call the principal voice, or the vox principalis. The examples we've looked at so far, the principal voice would be the top voice. See, there's the white pitches, and they are on top instead of on bottom. We've now moved to a system where the original voice, the principal voice, is on the bottom instead of on the top, and what we have on the top is added polyphony. Then we will have other sections where we have melisma. So let's listen just a little bit to Alleluia Justus ut Palma. Now, this is interesting, and it brings up a point in the book, which is that when we're looking at these polyphonic settings of chant, what we're often looking at is not the entire piece, just a section of the piece is set polyphonically, and everything else is still monophonic. What we're often seeing is the performance of pieces that would be sung antiphonally, meaning, or responsorially. Responsorially is more likely. So we have a soloist singing part, and then the choir sings the rest. Well, any improvisation would be done by the soloist, not by the choir, because the more people you have involved at the same time, the less freedom you can have, especially if you want everything to sound good and sound together. So moving forward, the next example that we have is Jubilemus Exultimus. I believe this is still considered Aquitanian polyphony. And this would be based on a verse, I believe. So a verse is important because it is not coming directly from the liturgy. This is something that would be religious but would be taken from outside. It's poetry written in Latin as line. Let me make sure I understand what I'm doing with this one, because I'm not as familiar with this example. Hold on. If you're trying to follow along in your book at this point in time, I am on page 85. Yeah, okay, so 85. Jubilemus Exultimus is a verse. And the tenor is what we are calling the original voice, the voice upon which everything is built. That would be this bottom voice here. Notice that it is moving more slowly than the top voice. So this is what we start to think of when we think of organum. We're thinking of the principal voice the original voice, the principal voice, being in the bottom and often moving more slowly than the added organal voice. The word organal is where organum comes from. We also see, okay, you can't see it looking at it. You're just going to have to take the word of the book, which is that the tenor of Jubilemus Exultimus is newly composed. It does not come from a different source. This is a brand new tenor. So let's listen to it. Notice how often the voices are coming back to the same pitch. That is entirely intentional. What we're seeing is that cadences, we really like moving back to that unison. And this is going to become important when we start learning about the motet, which is where we're going eventually in this chapter. All right, moving forward. So now we can move from the polyphony of the Aquitaine region of France to what we call the Notre Dame school. So Notre Dame is the cathedral that is in Paris. And this is going to become the new center. What we see in Notre Dame polyphony is not especially different from what we would have seen in Aquitanian polyphony, but it becomes even more ornate. And when we are talking about composers in the Notre Dame school, we're mostly talking about two composers. They're Leonin and Periton, or because we have to Latinize everything because the church is speaking in Latin, you can call them Leoninus and Peritinus. So they're the same person. Leonin or Leoninus, that's the same person. Periton or Peritinus is also the same person. So what do we know about these men? Well, we know that they were both associated with the Notre Dame Cathedral. We also believe that Leonin was older than Periton, and Leonin is credited with compiling a collection of organa that is called the Magnus Liber Organi. That translates roughly into something that is called the Big Book of Organum. And it is a compilation of different organal settings of the solo sections of responsorial liturgy to be associated with important days in the church calendar. So if you're thinking about the Mass, that's the Catholic Church service that we study most often because it's open to the public. The Mass has several different elements, the ordinaries and the propers. The propers change according to the liturgical calendar, and the ordinaries stay the same. I hope this is ringing a bell for you. But the propers and the ordinaries both contain several different texts that are classified as either propers or ordinaries. Both propers and ordinaries include texts that would be performed responsorially or antiphonally. in other words, instead of all being sung by a soloist or all being sung by a choir, you're alternating between some of it will be performed by a soloist and some of it will be performed by a choir. The part that is performed by a soloist is the part that develops into polyphony, because you'll add another person to that solo, and 2 people can improvise pretty easily. 14 people cannot improvise, not without very clear rules set in place. So when we're talking about the Magnus Liber, that is what that is. It is a collection of organum and various options for organum for all of the soloist sections of antiphonal or responsorial chants within the church service. Now, we believe that Leonin was at least responsible for compiling these. He didn't necessarily write all of them. Then, in another generation, Periton comes along and updates several of the polyphonic settings of organum according to what has become more fashionable. So I want to compare the Aquitanian polyphony that we were just listening to with an organal setting of chant that is attributed to Leonin. So here is the first one again. Jubilemus exultimus. Cadence. Octave. Cadence. So on and so forth. Okay. Here is Viter and Omnis as attributed to Leonin of the Notre Dame School. Okay, so everything that you have just heard is an elaboration of only the first pitch in the original chant. So what we see under Jubilemus is a much closer following. We do see melisma in the organal voice relative to the principal voice, but nothing equivalent to the length of ornamentation we see in Viter and Omnis, just on that first pitch. now we move to a different style. So this is the style that's referred to in the book as discant style. What's important to understand about discant style is that we have much less melisma in the upper voices relative to what we see in the lower voices. So the vox principalis, the principal voice, is moving at nearly the same speed as the vox originalis, the organal voice that has been added. Now back to organum. And then we're going to move to the section of the chant that would be sung by the entire choir. And then eventually we're going to get to the end of this plain chant, and then we will go back to essentially another section of organum. Now, if you look at this particular video, it keeps showing you little sections of the manuscript. And the reason that it's showing you these little segments of the manuscript is because it is showing you where the interpretation for this rhythm came from. What we're looking at is early modal rhythm. Modal rhythm is a system that came into place around this time in history, in which we can assume that we have different rhythmic patterns based on how many pitches we see tied together in complex neumes. We call this ligature. So in this case, this is 1, 2, 3. That's a 3-note neume. 1, 2. That's 2. 1, 2, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. So if we have a 3-pitch ligature followed by a bunch of 2-pitch ligatures, we understand that that is going to be rhythmic mode 1, which sounds like this. Bum, ba-da, 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 ba-da. Now, during this period of time when we're talking about modal rhythm, we really only have 2 different note lengths. We have a long note and a short note, and the long is called a long, and the short note is actually called a breve, B-R-E-V-E. Now, we have 6 different major kinds of rhythmic modes. The ones that tend to get used together a lot are modes 5 and 1. And that's what we tend to see even in Viter and Omnis that we were just listening to. Let me go back to that section where we, for just a moment, had discant. I will find it for you. This is the wrong one. That's why I can't find it. Okay, let me find the section where we have discant. Where are you? Okay, here we go. This is the discant section. So we have the 2 voices moving at much closer rates of speed to each other. What we have in the bottom voice is actually going to be rhythmic mode number 5. There's rhythmic mode number 5 right there. The top voice doesn't appear to be in a rhythmic mode that corresponds exactly. But that's going to change when we look at Periton's music. And back to, is very brief. That little section of discant is all that we get. Now, when we go to Periton's music, Periton updated a lot of the organum that we saw in the Magnus Liber Organi. And what we see first of all is we're moving towards more voices. So Leonin's Viderunt Omnis only includes 2 voices or 2 melodic lines. When we get to Periton, we already have 4. Now, as we were talking about earlier, when you add more voices, we have to cut back on the freedom that the voices have to improvise. It's just not possible to improvise with the same freedom with multiple people as compared to 2 people. Now, when we're looking at Viderunt Omnis by Periton, it's a much stronger use of modal rhythm in all the voices. You'll see that they're tending to all move together, and it looks like they are tending to use a combination of modes 1 and 5. Ba da da da, and then we'll go down here. Ba da. That's kind of what we see happening with Periton. All of that was elaboration on the very first pitch in Viderunt Omnis. So it's not considered discant because the original voice, the vox principalis, is not moving at a rate that is similar to what the upper voices are moving. The original voice, which we call the principal voice, is moving much slower than the upper voices. Therefore, organum not discant. Now, there's going to come a point where we do have discant, and I'm going to find it for you. Here's a good example of the top 2 voices are moving in what looks like mode 5, right there, and the third voice is moving in mode 1. Oh, let's look. Yeah, third voice, mode 1. Top 2 voices start out in mode 5. Cadence. Okay, now we are getting to a section of discant. So the bottom voice, the vox principalis, the principal voice, is going to be moving at a rate that's much closer to what we see in the upper voices. And back to organum. That's all we get before we go back to organum. And then, of course, back to plain chant. And then it says fine, but that's a lie, because you're actually going to go back and repeat everything that you just heard already. Okay, so that's periton. And from periton, we start to see the development of motets. So motets are going to be like the big important thing. What we're doing is we've already started a system that was very, very simple and based on mostly parallel motion and mirroring of a principal voice towards increasingly elaborate ornamentation of that principal voice. Now we are going to take the bass line, which is the original voice. We call it the principal voice. The principal voice from one of the simpler sections, the discant sections, where the bass and the higher voices are singing at nearly the same rate, as opposed to the florid organum, where we have one very long note in the principal voice and lots of melisma in the upper voices. We're going to, sorry, I know I'm repeating myself a lot because I want to try to get it to stick in your brain. And I feel like we'll be doing a fair amount of review when I see you on Thursday. But so we've got sections of florid or melismatic organum. Florid organum means that the original voice, which we call the principal voice, is moving very slowly, and it is being ornamented by a highly melismatic upper voice. Melismatic meaning that it's moving a lot more than the lower voice. So that's organum. Then we contrast that with these relatively short sections of discant. Discant is different from florid organum because in discant, the lower voice and the upper voice are moving at nearly the same rate. The next step, the next thing that we see that is the newest development in music, is we're going to take the original voice, the vox principalis, from a section of discant, where the two voices are moving at nearly the same rate. We're going to take only the original voice, which is on the bottom, and we are going to use that as a basis for an entirely new piece. So we're going to preserve that original voice from that one section of a much larger piece of music, and we're going to put a completely new melody above it, and we're going to have that new melody also sing completely different words from what was used in the original chant. That upper voice is called, sorry, I have to sneeze. Thank goodness. The upper voice is called the motetus, and that is where we get the word motet. So in early motets, you'll see that the original melody, which is in the lower voice, and it is called the tenor at this point in time, is moving at nearly the same rate as the added upper voice. One of the other things that you see is that the text that has been added in the upper voice, the brand new text with the brand new melody, is usually about the same thing as the original tenor melody. They are connected in meaning, and they would have been possibly included in church services because the original tenor melody is being taken from the liturgy of the church service. It is coming from those antiphonal pieces that are sung by the soloists. So the early motet is completely appropriate for performance in church. The two voices are going to move at about the same rate, and both voices, while they are singing different texts, the text is related to each other in subject matter. So here's an example of an early motet. Factum est salutare / dominus. Factum est salutare is the top voice, dominus is the bottom voice. So the top voice has got the majority of the text. Then a lot of times the bottom voice is just giving you pitches instead of text. All right, when we move forward through other kinds of early motets, what we start to see, and honestly pretty early on, is that we start to see motets in which the top voice is not necessarily about the same thing as the bottom voice. And the top voice isn't even necessarily religious anymore. In the case of Folle accoutumance dominus, the top voice, the motet voice, is actually satirical in nature. In other words, it is making fun of the church and of France in general. Now, we still see that the top voice and the bottom voice are moving at about the same speed, and the tenor or the borrowed melody that is in the bottom voice is exactly the same melody as the motet we just listened to. So the same tenor line, but a new interpretation in the motet line. But I guess not. Okay, here's another example. So, the reason that this one comes up, so this is Super te Jerusalem sed fulsit virginitas and dominus. Again, the tenor is the same as the tenor in the previous two motets we've looked at, but we've now added a third voice. And all three of the voices are singing completely different text. Now, in the case of this particular motet, we've moved back to text in the upper voices that is of similar meaning to the original tenor text. Let's listen to a little bit of it. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this particular motet setting is that unlike Periton's Vita and Omnis, which also introduces more voices, when we compare Periton's Vita and Omnis to Semper Te Jerusalem, what we'll see is that the voices are rarely all doing the same thing. We will often have similarities in rhythm between two of the three voices, but it's not even always the same two voices that are moving together. So it may not sound more complicated, but it is much more complicated. And part of the reason for this, the reason we're able to have these three voices moving more independently, is because of the advent of something called a Franconian notation. So this is moving to your textbooks on page, let me find it. It's after polyphonic conductives. Okay, page 99 is when we talk about Franconian notation. Now, Franconian notation doesn't look like this. I'm a little annoyed. Hold on. What we see in Franconian notation, it's covered in your textbook on page 99, and you're looking specifically at figure 5.5. So, page 99, figure 5.5. What we start to see is we're moving away from these rhythmic modes where we're just looking at ligatures to figure out what your rhythmic pattern is going to be, and instead we're replacing ligatures with different shaped notes that refer to more than two note lengths. When we look at music using modal rhythms, we only have two notes. There's a long note and there's a breve. Well, when we get to Franconian notation, we have added two more levels of notes. So we have a double long, a long, a breve, and a semi-breve. That means that a semi-breve, you can fit 4 semi-breves into a double long. That is 4 different kinds of notes as opposed to 2. This is going to eventually result in a new style of notating rhythm that is very, very similar to our modern system. It's called mensuration, and we'll be getting to it in chapter 5. But what you need to know right now is that this Franconian notation allowed for composers to write down much more complicated and much more independent rhythms. You can have many more things happening at the same time, and you can have much more independent voices. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we see happening in the motet. I'm going to pull up one more example of a piece that would have used Franconian notation. So we were just looking at Semper Te Jerusalem. Here's one by Adam de la Halle, de Madame Vian, Dies Comment Pourra, and Omnis. And again, it's the same tenor that we have been studying this entire time. It looks like it's been transposed, but the pitches are, the intervals are all the same. I'm bored, but you get the idea. Okay, moving forward. So I'm not as familiar with this one, but it is just a slightly more complicated version of exactly the developments we've already been looking at. So again, using Franconian rhythmic notation. I'm not as familiar with this one, and I'm not sure you're going to see a score. So I want you to just listen and try to listen for how different the voices are from each other. All right, so let's move from here to polyphony. That's the beginning of the motet and the beginnings of what is going to become a system of rhythmic notation much more similar to our modern systems, because we have greater variety in the difference of note lengths than they had in modal rhythm. So when we talk about music from England, what we're talking about is, first of all, the inclusion of thirds and sixths as consonances. This is going to be very important to developing our modern system of harmony. The main thing it talks about in the section on English polyphony is that we just love our rounds. So what is a round? A round is a piece of music in which the melody comes in at different times and essentially accompanies itself. Various versions of the round. We've got the rondellus and the rota, but they're basically just both rounds. If you've ever done like Are You Sleeping? Ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da. That's a round. You can perform it with different people coming in at different times, and you end up with complicated polyphony just because of how the voices layer on top of each other. So here is an example of a rota. Summer is a coming in. So what we see is this voice is going to just continue forever. And so are these two voices. And layered over that, we have this third melody here. But the accompaniment is just a combination of these voices in repetition forever. you go. Those English, man, they love their rounds. Okay, that's all that we have for chapter 5. The next thing we'll talk about is chapter 6. And as I said, I suspect that a lot of this is going to have to be reviewed. So we'll do the very best we can. See you on Thursday.